I am very happy to be here among you today in India, a country that's very dear to me. I'm pleased to see how daringly India has moved forward on the path of economic development without sacrificing its democratic values. We are now at a very special and crucial moment. It's a turning point. History is back. Last year has shown that the balance of powers is shifting. Emerging countries are claiming a bigger role in the world. The war in Georgia and the pride of the Chinese people during the Olympics were the two sides of a comeback of countries long left aside. And I strongly believe India will be a central actor in the new world order. It has a particular place and responsibility within the subcontinent, where changes and conflicts are so numerous. It has also a greater role to play on the international scene in becoming as quickly as possible a full member of an enlarged G8, as well as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. The economic crisis is putting the hierarchies of the economical world upside down. It is a challenge for all of us so as to enhance global regulation, but the solution will not come without the contribution of new markets and economies of Asia. Last element of hope, the election of Barack Obama has given the world a new perspective. After 8 years of a unilateral policy based on power, America is opening up to the world. A time of dialogue seems to begin in the Middle East in particular. It is an opportunity we must all seize. But yet, my visit here to India is also mixed with sadness, as I find a country deeply hurt by the tragic attacks in Mumbai. On November 26, all around the world, we deeply sympathized with the Indian people as our screens showed us the strikes in real time. 3 days of cold blood massacre, killing a huge number of people. India experiences all the promises, but also all the threats of this new world. Terrorism must be fought decidedly. Nothing can justify it. It's nothing more than a crime. How can we be the most effective in our fight against global terrorism? How can we help each other? That's a central question I have often been confronted as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, as a Minister of Interior Affairs, and the Prime Minister in France, a country that has been violently hit by mass terrorism in the past. It is my strong belief that terrorism calls for a powerful mobilization of all states. In this case, what kind of action should we wage? Is a global alliance against terrorism the right solution? First, international cooperation is needed to put all forces together to investigate and to dismantle terrorist movements and networks. But a global alliance engaged in a war against terrorism could lead to dangerous consequences. Legitimating and unifying a terrorist enemy that does not exist as a unity. In the end, it is only through worldwide dialogue and governance we can treat the roots of terrorism and really weaken terrorist movements by addressing the issue of development and cultural diversity. Yes, indeed, we need a global answer to the threats of terrorism. We must seek the greatest possible efficiency. A state alone is not powerful enough. Much has been done, but we've got to do more and to do better. To confront terrorism, we have to know its mechanism. What is it? What are its methods? What does it aim at? These questions define the actions to be taken. First, terrorism has deeply changed over the years. Terrorism is not something new in the international scene. It's happened in the past, from the assassins or hashishins of history sowing terror to the anarchists in the Balkans in the early 20th century. But with the use of terrorism by some extremists claiming to act for Islam, we have entered through successive waves into a new era. The first wave was national terrorism for political ends. Between the two world wars, the Muslim Brotherhood was active in Egypt. Then in the 70s and 80s, there were terrorist attacks in Europe and France, especially. The second wave is a more internationalist wave, internationalist terrorism, with no specific geographical roots. It surfaced in troubled spots in the 90s, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Chechnya, and transformed them into real bases for violent radical groups ready to strike targets in other Muslim countries. The third wave, the global terrorism, that began with September 11 and since then multiplied around the world, in Spain in 2004, in Great Britain, in London in 2005, and last of all in Mumbai last November, with the now well-known names of Al-Qaeda or Lashkar-e-Taiba. But let's take a closer look at the phenomenon. Those who want to attack us are a few hundred people, scattered around the globe in countries miles away from each other. And yet, the terrorists have turned their dispersion into an asset, their mobility into a fearful weapon against all the people of the world. They have turned their weakness into strength, so successfully that no state today can put the fight against terrorism anywhere but at the top of the list of its security priorities. Secondly, terrorism is the product of a strategy built on three pillars. The first pillar, the show of force, measured in terms of numbers killed and shock value. The second pillar is the media impact, images, which leads terrorists to strike a distant but symbolic target so as to gain legitimacy and to spread fear. The third pillar, jihad, drawing its inspiration from extremist Islam, September 11 was an act of jihad projected far from its traditional geographic sphere in order to get the attention of the entire world. In a matter of seconds, thanks to TV and radio, the terrorist organization claimed to rise the level of the leading world power. The terrorist objectives are the third element to be taken into account. Terrorist groups are determined to bring about divisions in the Muslim community so that they can be seen as the sole guarantors of a pure Islam. They attack Muslim countries as well as others, but in both cases, division is the goal. Within the Ummah, within the Muslim community, to end the domination of regimes considered impious and impose the Sharia, or even outside the Ummah, to weaken the non-Muslim countries. That's the picture we have to bear in mind. Terrorist groups have global aims, planetary networks, and techniques of mobility and dissemination that transcend the national borders. Terrorism has its own territorial organization with rear bases, recruitment zones, and battlegrounds. And terrorist organizations know how to gain support of certain states in certain circumstances in order to obtain safe haven and training facilities. Such a threat can only be addressed by strong cooperation of victim countries. First, the states must intensify the legal cooperation of their police forces and judicial systems. Today's procedures are too rigid and too formal. They're often too slow. Direct collaboration and legislative harmonization are the keys to success. Collaboration is crucial. That's why the international community should agree on a common obligation to ease cooperation and to quicken procedures. Harmonization makes collaboration more effective. States can learn from each other's experiences. In the last decade, many countries have developed new legislation to enforce their fight against terrorist movements. We should imitate the more practical and avoid the less efficient. Worldwide legislation is the third tool to fight terrorism. The United Nations must be at the center of common efforts to define and fight the terrorist threats. The existing armory is impressive. A dozen different texts of application. Still, we lack a global convention. It's supported by many countries, among which France, but it's stalled by problems of definition of terrorism. And we need to make sure that no state is allowed to show complacency towards terrorists. The second stake is intelligence. Intelligence has to be shared more effectively, and this has been a strong feature of the French-Indian strategic partnership. Intelligence services tend to work on their own and to keep the result of their work for themselves. Facing terrorism, states must learn to share information and resources. For example, in the field of interception, the Mumbai attacks have shown the importance of these techniques in preventing and repressing terrorist acts. Communications are no less important in a globalized world built on expanding information exchanges. How can we respect free speech and privacy and be sure that the internet, cell phones, the GPS are not used for terrorist ends? We need international directives to frame the control of communication networks. But the fight is also financial, and maybe more than ever, because terrorism needs channels and depositories to act. Institutions like the Financial Action Task Force have worked on international norms so as to control money transfers more effectively. Still, much has yet to be done, especially to fight financing through so-called charity organizations or through informal exchanges. But is this enough? Faced with barbaric crimes, we look for the utmost efficiency. How can we eradicate terrorism? The idea of a global alliance to wage a common war against all terrorist forces seems appealing. A global threat fought by a global force, putting together all means and weapons. But in fact, the idea of a war against terrorism may become dangerous in itself, because it may end up serving the interest of terrorist groups recognized as one global enemy and legitimized as the only opposition to all the states of the world community. There are three traps we must avoid in fighting against terrorism. The first trap is to equate the fight against terrorism with a merciless war. It seems inappropriate to me. Inappropriate because the warlike vocabulary presupposes a clearly identified enemy, which a state or group of states can oppose in a combat governed by rules and principles, namely the Geneva Conventions on the Law of War and Law in War. Yet, that's not a definition of terrorism. It is not a threat like others. It wears all the faces of those individuals who have decided to lock the world into violence and fear. It is inappropriate because terrorist groups respect none of the rules of warfare. They are not waging war against us from New York to Mumbai. They are engaged in a massacre of the innocents. So there is no possible peace with the terrorists. There is no conceivable agreement, armistice, or truce. Calling to war against terrorism is also risky since it gives the various terrorist groups a legitimacy and an audience they crave. Al-Qaeda, by the way, was the first organization to bring up the idea of a war against the West, the first to build itself legitimacy, not only on the ground, but also from the reaction of the Western powers. Bin Laden against Washington, for impoverished people receptive to fundamentalist language, it's like David against Goliath, weakness against power. It's a terrible trap, and we must get out of it as quickly as possible. In short, looming behind the words war on terrorism is confirmation that we are facing a clash of civilizations. For that is precisely where the terrorists want to lead us, to a head-on clash of religion and cultures, from which we will all emerge battered and broken. We have to face and fight this caricatural and pessimistic vision which ignores the diversity of Islam, the aspiration of the vast majority of Muslims for peace, and the reciprocal influences that have existed for centuries. We have to find a way out of this deadlock. The second trap is fear that would lead us to abandon our own values and principles. Confronted with the horror of terrorist acts, we may be tempted to make an exception and go outside democratic laws. This approach, I am convinced, is a dead end. What will be the value of a democracy that deprived its citizens of the most basic rights under the pretext of granting their security? Wouldn't it mean that terrorist organizations have already prevailed, if not over the land, at least in our minds? We, French and Europeans, have already had experience in the past of resorting to exceptional methods in the name of our citizens' security. I say this in all conscience. Such choices do not produce results, and they have to be paid for over years. In the face of terrorism, democracy must set the example. In all circumstances, we must abide by its demands. In a state that lives by the rule of law, there is no justification whatsoever for the government to deprive a defendant of the right of a fair defense, regardless of the crimes he has committed. The third trap is to count solely on the use of force. We all want to stop terrorist action as quickly as possible. We all dream of a world that would finally be rid of the fear of attacks. In this context, the use of military force may prove to be essential. We saw it in Afghanistan. The difficulty lies in effectively combining the use of force with all the other means at our disposal to combat terrorism. But we will not stop terrorism solely through force. The ill-considered use of force can only rally and motivate groups which, as we saw, were fragmented. It gives them the cohesion they are lacking, which could lead to an even more serious threat. The targeted use of force can be an illusion. Civilians always suffer, whatever the technologies employed, and the number of martyrs increases. Force opens wounds which become breaches the terrorists can rush to fill. Even victory is not a guarantee of peace in such a war. Military resolution of the problem in some cases only delays the reemergence of the evil. It may even deepen its roots and make a solution more difficult, as the American-led war in Iraq has shown in the past years. Let's take another example with the terrorism of LTTE in Sri Lanka. Military operations seems to progress towards elimination of the LTTE's forces, but if the operations don't take into account the humanitarian situation, if they're not followed by a strong political will for appeasement, the LTTA's neutralization may only be temporary. Avoiding these traps is crucial to overcome terrorism. A military alliance unifying all terrorists will risk to fall in all three of them. Surely it does not mean that the countries and peoples are not allies in this fight, or that they don't feel united. On the contrary, we must extend the solidarity to the whole scale of the problem. In the end, they are not shortcuts. We must follow the path of worldwide governance and refund international society. It's the only way to tear out the very roots of terrorist movements. We must build a new world order. It must be shared and accepted by all people and all cultures. This means finding common principles and sticking to them. They will keep us from getting off course and enhance the effectiveness of our action. Principles of the rule of law first. We have a duty to set an example in contrast to terrorists who would like to drag us into systematic repression and challenge public freedoms. Democracy's strengths lie in the place it gives to individual rights, the recognition of each person's value. We must stick to these values. This does not preclude firmness and the adaptation of our system to the threat. As the Interior Minister, I constantly looked for the most effective instruments to fight terrorism, but none of the decisions were taken without strict attention to the rule of law. Self-defense, yes, but no abdication of core values. The second principle is respect. What does extremist language feed on? The scorn we allegedly show for the poorest population, our alleged indifference in letting regions sink into violence, the suspicion that now attaches to Western interventions. Why do they act? In the name of what values? In whose economic or security interests? We have to show that we do listen and do pay attention and respect to the poor and the humiliated who aspire to recognition and dialogue. The third principle is unity. The terrorist plan provokes separation and reject that which brings us together. That is why unity is our most precious asset. It affirms our political resolve to face terrorism together. We will not end terrorism in a lasting way until progress is made in settling the most serious regional crisis and addressing lagging development in some countries. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has a place of its own in the mind of all the region. The start of the second Intifada in October 2002 became the catalyst for bringing to a head all the frustrations and resentments in the Middle East. People identify with it beyond national and ethnic divisions. That is why we cannot hope to see an end to Islamic terrorism without eliminating the ideological pretexts it adopts for its own uses. At this point, we have to make up for lost time. We have to move quickly. The inner turmoil in Afghanistan and Pakistan are also core issues to the spreading of terrorist violence. The presence of the NATO forces in Afghanistan need to follow a realistic plan so as to achieve stabilization, but there is no military solution, neither in Afghanistan, neither, of course, in Pakistan. Poverty is a firm ground for terrorism. India experiences it with the rising Naxalite movement, criminal methods used in the name of emancipation of exploited classes. That's why law enforcement is necessary under the rule of law, but it's not enough. The pace of development must be hastened and the fruits of economic growth must be shared fairly. We have to work out a worldwide governance to find common answers. How do we bridge the individual and the global, the defense of particular identities and the definition of common rules? For centuries, the objective of each of our countries has been to build a national democracy. Today, in the face of the new challenges to the world economic, social, cultural, environmental, ethical, we have to set about building a genuine world democracy. The United Nations is the only conceivable forum for defining the indispensable tools, norms, and structures. Is this a utopian vision? Not to my mind. Rather, it's an objective to aim for in a shaky world. We must put the dialogue of cultures and the summing up of different experiences at the core of a renewed world order. In this regard, India has a very important role to play, particularly to bridge the widening gap between North and South, East and West. India must share with the world its culture and its social and political principles even more, as it already does. The world's greatest democracy has achieved stability within difficult conditions and has shown the way for intercultural dialogue. The global stakes ask for worldwide governance, the regulation of the financial system, the response to climate change, as well as collective security, are challenges from which depends stability, prosperity, and even survival. In a world of growing migratory flows, we must always try to sew together what risks to be torn apart. We have the responsibility to preserve the common good of unity. We have the task of reconciliation. Ladies and gentlemen, standing before you in this city, which suffered the deadliest attacks during the last years, as well as Mumbai did 4 weeks ago, I want to say I am absolutely convinced that together we will see an end to terrorism. It's a question of resolve and lucidity. Resolve because to thwart future attacks, political leaders must be continually mobilized. Intelligence services must work night and day. The best technological means must be used. All citizens must be vigilant. Lucidity because we face a movement that is one step ahead of us, that has to be reversed. How? Terrorism is like an iceberg with a visible tip and a submerged part. It has to be dealt with globally. To deal with the tip, we must increase our efforts in areas like intelligence, police work, border control, judicial inquiries, tracking the field, technical cooperation with countries at risk, so that one by one we can trace the network and dismantle it. To deal with the submerged part, with the complex reality that terrorism feeds on, we must look for dialogue and respect and promote fair and sustainable development. Let's make no mistake about the challenge we are facing. Tomorrow, our children will want to know about the decision we have taken today for justice and peace. We must act now. We must mobilize now and work together for the world unity. Thank you very much.
I must say I've never heard a more clearer articulation of the problem of terror and how to tackle it than what Mr. Dominique de Villepin did. Yeah, as you know, India Today did recently bring out what we wouldn't want to call a white paper, but a document of an agenda for action for the nation. And sir, you did throw tremendous new light. It would have been a great contribution, and we'll put that in our subsequent reports. But I think the most interesting thing, I mean, firstly, when you look at talking of a global alliance, it seems like a no-brainer. We should have an alliance. But what I liked was your dissection of the problem. That, I think, was the key. The systematic way you analyzed it rather than getting into emotion, yours was a voice of reason. I particularly like the 3 traps that you talked about, that all of us as people and as government so easily fall into. And when you looked at the fact that when you talked of, firstly, let's not get into covert action, let's not go beyond the rule of law, let's do just when there's an attack, let's try and keep it within the boundaries, let's not step it. The other point you said is the use of military force and how, and the effect of that. And of course, you talked of building a brave new world order based on the principles of respect, unity, rule of law that you kept emphasizing, and of course dealing with the root causes of what causes terror and trying to combat it. So it's been a tremendous sweep across. And before I throw this open to the audience, I'd like to ask you a question, sir. Take the privilege of doing that. Given the fact that you've been Prime Minister before, we've had a major attack like Mumbai. It took all of India's sort of restraint to not to go to war with Pakistan or do limited strikes. Some of that has paid off. Pakistan has now admitted its complicity. But just as it happened across the border in Lahore, if there is another major terrorist attack like Mumbai, what do you think India should do? Should it go to war or do what you are talking about?
I believe to answer your question, you have to ask yourself, what is the aim of the terrorist? What the terrorist that will take the risk to attack Mumbai or any other Indian city, again, what would be their goal? What they should aim for? I believe exactly what you said. They would like India to go to war. They would like you to use force against Pakistan and mess everything up. That would be exactly their strategy. And you have to always understand very clearly what are the objectives of your adversary, what are the objectives of the people you have in front, and you have to do exactly the opposite. It is clear that the use of force can be helpful when you have a consensus among a regional or international community. Just after 9/11, the idea of using force in Afghanistan was an idea of consensus among the international community. So it was a good idea. Today, we are not in the same scenario in Afghanistan. And the idea of reinforcing the number of forces is not an idea of consensus among the international community. That's why I believe Barack Obama is taking a risk, because he has the idea of implementing more troops in Afghanistan, but he doesn't have the clear strategy that will go along with these more troops. So, cooperation is always the answer. You might find that with Pakistan, at one point, you would have to take together new steps against identified groups, against a very clear identified network of terrorism. But going to war without having clear goals, what for? What would be the objective of such a war? And what would you do after? Would be creating more frustration, more wounds. It's exactly what is happening when the United States are hitting at the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. What for? The only consequences is frustration, humiliation, and hitting civilians who are going to be people tempted by supporting terrorism in their village, in their own land. So the problem is not having emotion being a policy, not having your own personal feeling being a policy. A policy should be resulting from a clear analysis with clear goals and collective goals. And the more the situation is difficult, the more you need the consensus, not only the consensus in your country, but around your country supporting your action. So I believe the support for a global strategy against terrorism, the capacity you have to use good cooperation, and yes, you need the cooperation of the government of Pakistan to be effective against the networks that are dealing with terrorism in the region. But having a better cooperation, having new tools, judicial use of police, that may be more effective. That's what you need. Going to war, using military force is never the answer, because the consequences on the population, the consequences on the networks are very often exactly the contrary of what you want. If you take the example of Mexico, Mexico has been hit very hard in the last months also by terrorism, and they decided to use the military force in the country, much more than the police forces. And I believe, and I was there this time, I believe it was a mistake. Because you have to use capacities and forces who are accustomed, who are prepared to deal with that kind of issue. You don't put your military in the street if they don't know how to handle this kind of issue. If the only thing is they're going to do is to put their finger on some people that might not be responsible, the consequences are going to be worse, because you're going to divide the population. You're going to create such a climate which is going to create more tension and maybe look for scapegoats, more violence, more injustice. The key element in fighting terrorism is justice. Everything of what you are going to do must be fair and considered as fair by all the people around you. If you are going to act in an unfair way, if you are going to humiliate and frustrate people, then the backlash will be terrible.